You ever just look at your smartphone and think, how on earth does this thing even exist? I mean, how do we go from just, basic stuff pulled out of the ground to this incredible piece of tech in our hands? It's a great question, right? Well, it's not magic. It's actually a fundamental economic process called production. So yeah, let's dive into this. It's a core concept, really, of how value is actually created in an economy. Okay, so first things first. In economics, production doesn't mean creating matter out of thin air. It's not like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Instead, it's all about taking things that already exist and just making them more useful. Economists have a cool term for this. They call it adding utility. So it's not about creating something from nothing. It's about making things more valuable to us. It's a value add at every single step. And this is where it gets really interesting. I mean, we usually think of production as just making things, right? That's what they call form utility, turning a log of wood into a table. But check this out. Value is also created by just moving things to where they're needed. That's place utility. And what about storing them until the time is right? That's time utility. And then finally, value can come from pure skill, like a doctor's expertise. They call that personal utility. So it's not just about manufacturing. All right, so to create any of that utility, you've got to have the right ingredients. Think of it like a recipe. And in the recipe for production, there are 4 fundamental ingredients, the absolute essentials. And here they are. You can think of these as the 4 key players on the team. First up, you've got land. And that's not just dirt. It means all natural resources. Then you've got labor. That's the human effort, the brains and the brawn. Next is capital. These are the tools, the machines, the factories we've already built. And finally, you have the entrepreneur. This is the captain of the team, the one with the vision who pulls the other 3 together and takes all the risk. Now, it's super important to get how these players are different. Land, for example, is passive, and it's fixed. You just can't make more of it. But labor, that's active. And get this, it's perishable. A day of work that isn't used is just gone forever. You can't save it for later. And unlike land, labor is mobile. A person can move for a job. It's not always easy, for sure, but you can't exactly pick up a coal mine and move it, can you? Okay, so we've talked about land and labor. But what about capital? The tools, the machines, the factories. They don't just magically appear, right? An economy has to actually build them, and that process is called capital formation. Let's break down how that works. It's basically a 3-stage process. So the very first step is actually pretty simple, but it is absolutely critical. It's savings. I mean, think about it. To build for the future, a society just can't consume everything it makes today. Some of that income, whether it's from people, companies, or the government, it has to be put aside. Because without savings, you've got nothing to invest. It's the starting block for everything. All right, on to stage 2. See, just saving money isn't enough. Hiding it under your mattress doesn't do the economy any good. Those savings need to be mobilized. They have to be collected from all the different savers and channeled into one big pool. And that right there is the super important job of banks and other financial institutions. And that brings us to the final step, investment. This is where all that pooled up cash gets put to work. It's converted into real productive assets. We're talking new factories, better infrastructure, new technology. And here's the beautiful part. All of that creates more income, which then allows for even more savings, which fuels more investment. And you get this amazing cycle of economic growth. So we've got our capital, our land, and our labor. But what about the entrepreneur who's trying to juggle all of this? What's their actual goal? You might think it's just make as much money as possible, right? But the reality for a modern business is way more complicated. They're trying to balance survival, profit, social responsibilities, how they treat their people. It's a huge balancing act. And it's not just about managing the day-to-day stuff. The entrepreneur has this other massive role, to be an innovator. The famous economist Joseph Schumpeter said it best. He pointed out that it's the entrepreneur who's always introducing new products, new ways of doing things, totally new business models. They are literally the engine of economic progress. Of course, having big goals is one thing, but actually achieving them? That's a whole other story. The real world is just packed with obstacles that make running a business a constant uphill battle. And man, these challenges are everywhere. Businesses are trying to operate in a world full of uncertainty. They're dealing with everything from customers who change their minds, to government red tape, to real-world problems like power cuts or not being able to find enough skilled people. Just navigating all of that, that's a huge part of the job. Okay, let's get really practical for a second. Picture this. You've got a factory. You've got a fixed number of machines. Now, what happens to your total output if you just keep hiring more and more workers? This is where a super famous and fundamental economic idea comes into play. It's called the law of diminishing returns. Now, have a look at this table. Total product is pretty straightforward, right? But the real story, the juicy part, is in that marginal product column. See, that tells you the extra output you get from hiring just one more person. It's the key to understanding efficiency. So let's watch what happens to that number as we go through three very different stages. Okay, so right at the beginning, in stage one, adding more people is fantastic. It's a huge win. The first few workers can specialize, the machines get used way more efficiently, and the extra output from each new person, that marginal product, it actually goes up. You could call this the honeymoon phase of production. But then you hit stage two. Things start to get a little crowded. You've still got the same number of machines, remember? So each new worker, yeah, they still add to the total output, but they add less than the person before them. That marginal product starts to drop. This right here is the classic stage of diminishing returns. And finally, if you just keep pushing it, you hit stage three. And this is basically chaos. People are literally bumping into each other, getting in each other's way. Adding one more worker at this point is a terrible idea. It actually makes your total output go down. Their marginal product turns negative. You're going backwards. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that a smart, rational producer is always going to operate in stage two. Why? Well, stage one is inefficient because you're leaving potential on the table, and stage three is just self-sabotage. The sweet spot where you're really getting the most bang for your buck is always going to be somewhere in that phase of diminishing but still positive returns. Which brings us to our final big question. How does a firm actually find that perfect sweet spot? How do they figure out the best, most cost-effective mix of inputs, like workers and machines, to use to get the job done? Well, one tool they use is something called an isoquant curve. The easiest way to think about this is like a recipe map. Let's say you want to make exactly 1,000 widgets. You could use a ton of people and only a few machines, or you could use a ton of robots and only a few people. Any single point along this curve is just a different recipe that gives you the exact same final result. Okay, so next up, we have something called the isocost line. And if the isoquant curve is your recipe map, the isocost line is your budget. It's really simple. It just shows all the different combinations of workers and machines that you can possibly afford with the money you have. So let's put those two together. The isoquant shows you all the ways you could technically make your product. The isocost line shows you all the combinations you can actually afford. The whole game, then, is to find where these two things line up perfectly. And that sweet spot, that point of maximum efficiency, is right where your budget line just barely touches the highest possible output curve it can reach. That's it. That's your least cost combination to get the job done. But this kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it? We talked about how modern businesses have to balance so many different goals, not just pure profit. So it leaves us with a big question. Is this focus on pure mathematical efficiency the only thing that really matters for a business's long-term success?